The courtroom was busy that morning, filled with people waiting for the hearing to begin. Some were journalists, others were family members, and a few were just curious citizens wanting to see justice in action. At the center of it all sat Judge Althea Johnson. She had earned a reputation over the years as someone who was fair but firm, a person who could handle even the most difficult cases without letting her emotions take control. Today, however, she faced a situation that was unusual and uncomfortable. Judge Johnson was one of the few black judges in the city, and she knew that with her position came both responsibility and scrutiny. She was not just representing herself, but also the integrity of the entire justice system. As she looked around the courtroom, she noticed a group of police officers sitting in the gallery. At first, they appeared to be paying attention, but soon she saw subtle smirks and whispering among them. She straightened in her chair, keeping her calm exterior, but inside she registered the disrespect. The officers were laughing quietly at her, mocking her with their body language and gestures. It was not just inappropriate, it was deeply disrespectful. The hearing was about a controversial police shooting that had drawn media attention and public outcry. The tension in the room was already high because people wanted answers and accountability. Now, with the officers' behavior, the tension took on another layer. Judge Johnson took a slow breath and began the session, her voice steady and clear. As she spoke, she noticed the officers' laughter growing louder. One of them leaned back, laughing openly, and another exchanged a look with a colleague as if to say, "Can you believe this?" The courtroom felt divided. Some people were shocked by the officers' behavior, while others tried to ignore it, not wanting to escalate the situation. Despite the distraction, Judge Johnson maintained her composure. She was used to being in challenging situations, but she knew this was different. This was not just about managing a courtroom. This was about asserting authority in a space where some people thought they could challenge it simply because of her race. She had faced prejudice before, but this open mockery was bold and brazen. She continued to speak, explaining the legal procedures and the charges involved in the case, all while keeping a sharp eye on the officers. She wanted them to understand that their behavior would not go unnoticed. The officers' laughter started to get under the skin of the lawyers as well. They exchanged uneasy glances and whispered to each other, unsure of how to respond. The public in the gallery shifted in their seats, some uncomfortable, others quietly observing. Judge Johnson paused, letting a few moments of silence hang in the air. She did not raise her voice or confront them angrily. Instead, she allowed the courtroom to feel the weight of the disrespect. It was a subtle but powerful strategy. By staying calm, she was already demonstrating control over the situation. The officers, expecting her to react with anger or frustration, were likely surprised by her restraint. As the hearing progressed, Judge Johnson started to address the officers indirectly. She reminded everyone in the courtroom about the importance of respect, not just for her as the judge, but for the law and for justice itself. Her words were firm but measured. She spoke about the role of the court in maintaining fairness and how everyone present, including law enforcement, had a duty to uphold the dignity of the legal process. Her voice did not waver. She made it clear that mockery and disrespect would not be tolerated in her courtroom. The officers shifted in their seats, some looking uncomfortable for the first time. A few tried to hide their reactions behind crossed arms or papers, but Judge Johnson could see through it. She had learned to read people, to notice even the smallest signs of defiance or hesitation. Her calm yet unwavering gaze made it clear that she was fully aware of their behavior. The courtroom had become a stage where authority and prejudice clashed quietly but powerfully. The public noticed the tension and began to whisper among themselves. Some people were inspired by Judge Johnson's composure, while others were shocked at the audacity of the officers. The journalists in the room started taking notes, sensing that this was not just another hearing. It was becoming a story of courage and professionalism under pressure. Judge Johnson continued to navigate the hearing, balancing the need to address the case at hand, while subtly reminding everyone of the importance of respect. At one point, an attorney tried to object to a question, and Judge Johnson handled it swiftly, without letting the courtroom atmosphere distract her. She ruled on the objection calmly and explained her reasoning clearly, reinforcing her authority. The officers' laughter had diminished slightly, but she knew it was not gone. They were waiting, perhaps expecting her to lose control at some point, but she remained steady. Her calmness was disarming. It was a reminder that true authority does not need to shout or intimidate. It is shown through confidence, knowledge, and presence. As the session continued, Judge Johnson made eye contact with several members of the public, silently communicating that they should not let the officers' behavior shake their faith in the justice system. She was aware of the responsibility she carried, not just for the outcome of this case, but for setting an example. Her actions were teaching everyone in the room about patience, dignity, and the power of quiet strength. The officers began to realize that their laughter was no longer effective. Judge Johnson's calm authority was creating an uncomfortable mirror for their behavior. What had started as an attempt to mock and intimidate was now revealing their own unprofessionalism. The courtroom, once filled with tension and subtle hostility, was slowly shifting. People were beginning to see that mockery and disrespect would not dominate this space. Judge Johnson's quiet power was becoming evident to all. As the hearing neared the midpoint, Judge Johnson paused again. She looked around the courtroom, letting the silence speak volumes. The officers were no longer laughing openly, and the public had begun to settle into a watchful, attentive state. She continued the proceedings, methodically moving through the case, but always keeping an eye on the officers. Every word she spoke, every decision she made, was calculated to maintain control and assert respect without resorting to anger or confrontation. By the time the morning session ended, the officers were subdued, if only slightly. Judge Johnson had demonstrated that authority and respect were not given by position alone. They were earned through demeanor, knowledge, and poise. The courtroom had witnessed more than just legal arguments. It had seen a lesson in courage and professionalism. Judge Johnson's handling of the situation was already leaving an impression on everyone present. The journalists in particular sensed that this story would resonate beyond the city, as it highlighted not just a legal case but a larger issue of respect, race, and authority. As people filed out of the courtroom, many stopped to watch Judge Johnson as she remained at her bench, calm and composed. She greeted a few colleagues quietly, exchanged a nod with a lawyer, and then turned her attention to reviewing documents for the next session. Behind her composed exterior, she reflected on the morning's events. She knew that this was only the beginning, and that the officer's disrespect might not end quietly. She also knew that her response had set a clear standard. She had shown that mockery and prejudice would not shake her focus or her authority. In the hallways outside, whispers followed her. People discussed the boldness of the officers, the calmness of the judge, and the power of composure in the face of disrespect. Some people were inspired, some were shocked, and some were simply curious about what would happen next. Judge Johnson walked with purpose, aware that she had made a mark on the day, and perhaps on the larger conversation about race, authority, and justice. Her calm, steady approach had already started to turn the situation around, and she knew that the story was far from over. Today was the beginning of a challenge, but also the beginning of a demonstration of how intelligence, patience, and quiet authority could change the course of a tense and difficult situation. After the morning session, the courtroom emptied slowly. Some people lingered, whispering to each other about what had just happened. Judge Althea Johnson remained at her bench, quietly reviewing notes and preparing for the next part of the hearing. She had already sensed that the officer's behavior would not stop, and she needed to be ready for the challenges ahead. Her calmness was deliberate, a shield against the provocation she faced. She knew that how she handled the next moments could define not only this case, but also send a message about respect and authority. As the next session began, the officers returned to the gallery. Their earlier laughter had faded into subtle smirks and quiet whispers, but Judge Johnson could sense the underlying attitude. They were testing her patience, trying to see if she would react differently this time. She did not give them the satisfaction. She started the hearing by outlining the agenda for the day and reminded everyone of the rules of the courtroom. Her voice was firm and clear, leaving no room for misunderstanding. She made it obvious that any further disrespect would have consequences. The lawyers presented their arguments, and Judge Johnson listened attentively. At the same time, she kept a watchful eye on the officers. She noticed one of them leaning back with T-crossed arms, clearly trying to project confidence and indifference. Another whispered something to a colleague and tried to stifle a laugh. It was clear they had underestimated her composure and presence. Rather than react impulsively, she took note of their behavior and continued to manage the hearing. Her focus was on maintaining control and demonstrating that the courtroom was a place for respect, not ridicule. During a short break, Judge Johnson requested the courtroom clerk to provide a list of any prior complaints or disciplinary actions filed against the officers present. This was unusual, but she knew it was necessary to fully understand the context and prepare for what she might need to do next. The officers noticed her request, and the air shifted slightly. Their smirks faded, replaced with uneasy glances. For the first time, they realized that her calmness was not a weakness. It was strategy. When the hearing resumed, Judge Johnson addressed the officers directly, asking them to stand and identify themselves. The courtroom went silent. The officers hesitated, exchanging nervous glances, unsure how to respond. They had never been called out in this manner before, and the situation caught them off guard. As they complied, Judge Johnson maintained her calm, steady gaze, allowing the room to feel the weight of the moment. Her approach was calculated. She did not shout or humiliate them. She simply exposed their behavior to the full view of the courtroom. Once they were identified, Judge Johnson spoke about the importance of respect for the court. She explained that mocking or laughing at the authority of a judge undermined not only the legal process but also public trust in law enforcement. Her words were clear, firm, and precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The officers began to realize that their behavior could have serious consequences, not just professionally, but also in the eyes of the public. The courtroom was now fully attentive, watching how this confrontation would unfold. Her next move was even more strategic. Judge Johnson called for the police chief to attend the courtroom. The officers' discomfort increased. They understood the gravity of her actions. She was not simply addressing disrespect in the moment. She was holding them accountable to a higher standard. The chief arrived, and Judge Johnson calmly explained the situation, providing details of the officers' behavior and emphasizing the need for accountability. The presence of the chief made the officers more aware of the seriousness of their actions, and their earlier bravado had vanished. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Journalists began taking notes, sensing a story that went beyond the legal case at hand. People were witnessing a rare moment, a judge confronting disrespect with intelligence, patience, and authority, rather than anger. Judge Johnson continued with the hearing, balancing the ongoing legal matters while subtly reminding everyone present of the importance of decorum and professionalism. Her calm authority was slowly transforming the atmosphere in the room. The officers, once mocking, were now subdued and cautious. As the hearing progressed, Judge Johnson used her attention to detail to strengthen her position. She referenced legal precedents and past cases where professional misconduct had consequences. Her words were precise and backed by law, leaving no room for doubt. She made it clear that disrespectful behavior in her courtroom was not a joke. It was a serious breach of professional conduct. The officers understood this, and the public began to recognize the power of her measured approach. At one point, one of the officers shifted uncomfortably and muttered under his breath. Judge Johnson paused and looked directly at him. Without raising her voice, she asked him to repeat what he had said for the record. The room held its breath. The officer hesitated and then stayed silent. This moment emphasized her control and reinforced that in her courtroom, every action had consequences. Her strategy was working. She had turned the tables without resorting to humiliation or aggression, and the courtroom was paying attention. The session continued with Judge Johnson guiding the proceedings with calm precision. She asked questions, allowed arguments, and managed objections while keeping the officers' behavior in view. Each time they showed even a hint of disrespect, she subtly reminded them of the rules and expectations. Her patience and poise were impressive, and the public, the lawyers, and even some of the officers began to realize the strength of her leadership. By mid-afternoon, the officers were visibly subdued. Their earlier laughter and smirks had disappeared, replaced with nervous glances and restrained body language. Judge Johnson had managed to assert authority without confrontation, showing that respect could not be challenged lightly. Her calm intelligence was a powerful tool, and the courtroom had witnessed a demonstration of true leadership under pressure. As the day came to a close, Judge Johnson summarized the proceedings. She reinforced the importance of respect, professionalism, and accountability. She made it clear that mockery and prejudice had no place in her courtroom. The officers were now fully aware that their behavior had been observed, documented, and would be addressed. The public left the courtroom inspired by her composure and clarity, recognizing that this was more than a legal case. It was a lesson in dignity, patience, and the quiet power of authority. Judge Johnson stayed behind after everyone left to review notes and prepare for the next steps. She knew that the officers' actions might not end quietly, but she also knew that she had established her authority clearly and strategically. She had turned a situation of disrespect into an opportunity to demonstrate the power of calm, intelligence, and principled leadership. Her approach had already started to make an impression, not just in the courtroom, but in the larger conversation about race, authority, and respect in public service. In the quiet of her chambers, Judge Johnson reflected on the day.
She had faced open mockery, yet she had responded with patience, strategy, and dignity.
Her actions had set a precedent for how disrespect could be addressed without compromising professionalism. She understood that her role extended beyond this case. She was representing fairness, justice, and the integrity of the legal system. Every decision, every action was a message to those who thought authority could be mocked. Judge Johnson had made it clear, in her courtroom, respect was not optional, and justice was guided by intelligence, patience, and unwavering dignity. The next morning, the courtroom felt tense but quieter than before. Judge Althea Johnson entered calm and collected, fully aware that today's session could bring more challenges. The officers who had mocked her previously were present again, their faces more serious and cautious. They seemed to understand that their behavior had been noted, and that this was no ordinary day in court. People in the gallery noticed the difference immediately. There was no laughter, no smirks, only an uneasy silence as the judge took her seat. Judge Johnson began by addressing the courtroom in her usual measured tone. She reminded everyone that the purpose of the court was to serve justice fairly and to maintain respect for the law. She emphasized that decorum was not optional, and that everyone, including law enforcement, was expected to conduct themselves professionally. Her words were calm but carried an undeniable authority. The officers straightened in their seats, realizing that the judge's patience and calm demeanor were not signs of weakness, but of deliberate strategy. She then moved on to the main part of the hearing. The case involved complex details and sensitive issues, and Judge Johnson meticulously guided the lawyers through the proceedings. As she listened to testimony and reviewed evidence, she remained aware of the officers in the gallery. She noticed small gestures, glances, shifts in posture, whispers that revealed their unease. She had turned the initial mockery into a situation where their every movement was under scrutiny, and she was not about to let it go unnoticed. Judge Johnson paused at a strategic moment and addressed the officers directly, asking for clarity about their roles in past cases and interactions with the public. She asked them to provide explanations and accounts of any complaints that had been filed against them. The officers, now fully aware that their actions were being closely monitored, hesitated before answering. The courtroom held its breath as they spoke, each response revealing more about the extent of their previous behavior and attitude. Judge Johnson listened carefully, her expression calm but firm, making it clear that she was taking note of everything. The public in the gallery began to realize the significance of what was unfolding. Judge Johnson was not only managing a legal case but also addressing deeper issues of accountability and professionalism. Her approach was subtle yet powerful. She did not humiliate anyone publicly. Instead, she exposed the facts with clarity, showing how disrespect and mockery could not go unchallenged. The officers, who had once seemed untouchable, now appeared vulnerable under the weight of her calm authority. At one point, Judge Johnson paused the hearing to allow for a short recess. During this time, she requested that the courtroom clerk provide a full record of the officers' professional histories, including any complaints or disciplinary actions. This information would be essential for the next step she planned to take. The officers were aware that their actions were being documented and that the consequences could extend beyond this courtroom. They remained silent, a marked change from their previous demeanor. When the hearing resumed, Judge Johnson addressed the court and the officers with precision. She explained that the behavior witnessed in the previous sessions was not acceptable, and that there were mechanisms within the justice system to hold individuals accountable for such conduct. Her voice remained steady and authoritative, ensuring that the courtroom understood the seriousness of the matter. The officers could no longer dismiss her authority, and the public could see the power of calm, deliberate action. She then introduced a key element of her strategy. Judge Johnson asked for the attendance of the police chief, explaining that the presence of leadership was necessary to address the situation appropriately. The officers' discomfort increased. They understood that their earlier behavior could now have real repercussions. The chief arrived promptly, and Judge Johnson calmly outlined the disrespectful behavior observed, emphasizing the importance of accountability and professionalism. The courtroom observed as authority met arrogance, and it became clear that the balance of power had shifted. The judge's approach had a profound effect on the officers. They realized that their previous mockery could no longer be ignored. Judge Johnson had demonstrated that respect and decorum were non-negotiable, and any attempts to undermine them would be addressed with strategy and intelligence rather than anger. The public in the gallery recognized the significance of this moment. What they were witnessing was a display of leadership and courage, a demonstration that patience and calmness could overcome arrogance and disrespect. Judge Johnson continued with the proceedings, carefully balancing the need to address the legal case while ensuring that the officers understood the consequences of their behavior. She referenced legal standards in prior cases, reinforcing that professional conduct was a fundamental expectation. Her words were deliberate and backed by evidence, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The officers were now fully aware that their actions were under scrutiny, and the courtroom had become a space of accountability. Throughout the day, Judge Johnson maintained her composure, even when faced with subtle provocations. The officers attempted to whisper or exchange glances, but she handled each moment with precision. Her calm authority was a tool, and she wielded it skillfully. Each interaction reinforced the message that respect in the courtroom was mandatory, and that any attempt to undermine it would be documented and addressed. The public watched closely, recognizing the importance of her approach and the courage it required. By the afternoon, the officers were subdued, their previous confidence replaced with cautious awareness. Judge Johnson had successfully shifted the dynamic in the courtroom. She had turned what could have been a tense, disrespectful environment into a lesson in authority, patience, and strategic leadership. The public, the lawyers, and even some of the officers began to understand the power of calm, deliberate action in the face of disrespect. As the session concluded, Judge Johnson summarized the proceedings and outlined expectations moving forward. She emphasized that respect, professionalism, and accountability were non-negotiable, and that any future incidents would be addressed with the full weight of the legal system. The officers were left with no illusions about the seriousness of their behavior, and the public left the courtroom inspired by the judge's courage and composure. Judge Johnson stayed behind to review the notes and prepare for the next steps. She understood that this situation was far from over, but she had established her authority and set a clear standard for behavior in her courtroom. Her strategy had transformed a moment of disrespect into an opportunity to teach, lead, and assert the importance of dignity and professionalism. The courtroom, once a space of tension and mockery, had become a place where respect and authority were unmistakably clear. In the quiet of her chambers, Judge Johnson reflected on the day's events. She had faced open disrespect and handled it with intelligence, patience, and strategic action. Her approach had not only addressed the immediate issue, but it also sent a powerful message about the importance of professionalism and respect in public service. She understood that her role extended beyond the courtroom. She was setting an example for the public, law enforcement, and the justice system as a whole. Every decision, every action had reinforced the principle that respect was earned and maintained through calm, deliberate leadership. The public's reaction outside the courtroom confirmed the impact of her actions. Journalists spoke about the judge's composure, lawyers shared their admiration, and ordinary citizens expressed how inspiring it was to see someone confront disrespect with intelligence rather than anger. Judge Johnson's approach had created a ripple effect, showing that courage could take many forms, and that sometimes calm strategy could be more powerful than confrontation. The courtroom was no longer just a place for legal proceedings. It had become a stage for lessons in dignity, leadership, and the quiet power of authority. The next day, The courtroom felt different from before. People had arrived early, aware that the previous sessions had been unusual. Word had spread quickly about Judge Althea Johnson's calm and strategic handling of the officers who had mocked her. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if everyone knew they were about to witness something important. Judge Johnson entered the room with her usual composed demeanor, ready to continue addressing the case while ensuring respect and accountability were maintained. The officers were present again, noticeably more subdued. Their previous mockery and smirks had vanished, replaced by careful glances and rigid postures. Judge Johnson greeted the courtroom calmly and began the session. She reminded everyone about the rules and emphasized that decorum was essential. Her voice was steady and firm, conveying authority without anger. The public, lawyers, and officers all took note of her clear command of the room. Her presence alone reminded everyone that respect was expected at all times. Judge Johnson proceeded to review the case in detail. She listened carefully to each testimony, asked thoughtful questions, and ensured that the legal process was followed meticulously. At the same time, she kept an eye on the officers, observing every movement and subtle gesture. She noticed nervous glances, slight fidgeting, and attempts to maintain a facade of composure. It was clear that her calm authority had unsettled them, and she allowed the courtroom to feel the impact of their shift in demeanor. During a brief pause in the proceedings, Judge Johnson requested the latest reports from the police department regarding the officers' conduct. She had already prepared for this step, knowing that a thorough understanding of their records would be necessary to address the situation properly. The officers realized that their previous actions were being examined in detail and that the consequences could be significant. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, but Judge Johnson maintained her calm, letting the weight of her presence do much of the work. When the hearing resumed, Judge Johnson addressed the officers directly, reminding them of their responsibility to uphold the law and maintain professionalism. She explained that any further disrespect or unprofessional behavior would result in formal consequences, including disciplinary action and public censure. Her tone was firm, measured, and authoritative, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The officers, now fully aware of the seriousness of the situation, remained silent and attentive, their previous arrogance replaced by cautious awareness. The public in the gallery began to whisper among themselves, recognizing the significance of what was happening. Judge Johnson was not only managing a legal case but also addressing deeper issues of accountability, respect, and leadership. Her actions demonstrated that calm, strategic responses could be more effective than confrontation or anger. People watched closely, inspired by her composure and the way she maintained control over a challenging situation. At a key moment, Judge Johnson asked the police chief to speak about the department's expectations for officer conduct. The chief outlined the standards clearly, emphasizing the importance of professionalism, respect, and accountability. The officers in the gallery listened carefully, understanding that their actions were being formally addressed and that the court was serious about upholding these standards. The courtroom had become a space of reflection and accountability, where authority and responsibility were clearly defined. Judge Johnson then proceeded to guide the legal proceedings with precision, ensuring that the case moved forward while maintaining attention on the broader lesson of respect and professionalism. She asked detailed questions, allowed witnesses to provide testimony, and handled objections with clarity. Throughout the session, she demonstrated that authority was not about aggression, but about knowledge, composure, and strategic action. Her presence and approach had transformed the dynamic of the courtroom, leaving a lasting impression on everyone present. By mid-afternoon, it was clear that the officers had internalized the lesson of the previous sessions. Their behavior had shifted from mockery and arrogance to cautious attention. Judge Johnson had achieved this without raising her voice or humiliating them publicly. Instead, she had relied on calm observation, strategic questioning, and the careful use of procedural authority. The public and the legal professionals in the courtroom recognized the significance of this approach, understanding that true leadership often involved patience, intelligence, and quiet strength. As the session continued, Judge Johnson emphasized the importance of accountability, not only in the courtroom but also in public service. She spoke about how respect for the law and for others was fundamental to the functioning of society. Her words resonated with the audience, inspiring reflection and awareness. The officers, now subdued, listened attentively, recognizing that their actions had been observed and that their future behavior would be closely monitored. At the conclusion of the hearing, Judge Johnson summarized the key points, reinforcing the expectations of professionalism, respect, and accountability. She made it clear that the courtroom was a place where integrity mattered, and that any attempts to undermine it would be addressed through proper legal channels. The officers left with a clear understanding that their previous behavior had consequences, and the public left inspired by the judge's poise and strategic handling of a difficult situation. After the courtroom emptied, Judge Johnson stayed behind to review notes and prepare for the next steps. She knew that the officers' actions had caused tension, but she had successfully transformed a moment of disrespect into an opportunity to demonstrate leadership and authority. Her calm, deliberate approach had made an impact not only in the courtroom, but also in the broader conversation about respect, professionalism, and the responsibilities of public service. The media outside the courthouse quickly picked up the story. Journalists highlighted Judge Johnson's composure, intelligence, and strategic handling of the officers' disrespect. Public reaction was largely positive, with many people praising her courage and the way she had addressed the situation without resorting to confrontation. Discussions began about the importance of respect in the justice system, the responsibilities of law enforcement, and the power of calm, thoughtful leadership. Judge Johnson's approach had created a ripple effect. People from different parts of the community began to see the value of patience, strategy, and dignity in addressing challenges. The officers, while initially a source of tension, had become examples of how accountability could be enforced through observation, documentation, and calm authority. The courtroom, once a space of potential chaos, had become a demonstration of the principles of respect, professionalism, and leadership in action. In the quiet of her chambers, Judge Johnson reflected on the day's events. She had faced a situation where arrogance and disrespect could have disrupted the legal process. Instead, she had turned it into an opportunity to demonstrate leadership, intelligence, and patience. Her actions had reinforced the importance of authority, accountability, and professionalism. She understood that the lessons learned in this courtroom could extend beyond these walls, influencing public perceptions and inspiring conversations about integrity and respect in public service. Judge Johnson prepared for the next session with the confidence that her approach had set a precedent. The officers would remember the lessons of these days, and the public had witnessed a powerful example of how calm, strategic leadership could overcome arrogance and disrespect. The courtroom had become more than just a place for legal proceedings. It had become a space for demonstrating the values of dignity, patience, and thoughtful authority, leaving a lasting impact on all who had been present. The final day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom was filled with a mix of anticipation and respect. Word of Judge Althea Johnson's previous sessions had spread widely, and many were curious to see how she would conclude the case and address the officers' behavior fully. The public, the lawyers, and even the police officers themselves were all aware that today's session would be decisive in setting a lasting standard of accountability and respect. Judge Johnson entered the courtroom with her usual calm, measured demeanor. She acknowledged the audience with a nod, signaling that the day would proceed with order and focus. The officers, now fully subdued, were seated quietly, aware that their previous behavior had been observed and would be addressed seriously. There was no laughter, no smirks, only careful attention. The public sensed the tension but also felt a sense of respect for the judge's authority and poise. She began by reviewing the proceedings of the past sessions, highlighting how important it was for everyone in the courtroom to maintain professionalism. She emphasized that respect for the law and for each other was fundamental to the justice system. Her tone was firm yet calm, and every word carried weight. The officers listened closely, understanding that their actions had been documented and that accountability was imminent. Next, Judge Johnson addressed the legal aspects of the case in detail, carefully considering testimony, evidence, and procedural matters. She handled objections and questions with precision, ensuring that the case proceeded fairly and thoroughly. At the same time, she subtly kept the focus on the officers, making it clear that their behavior had not gone unnoticed and that respect and professionalism were non-negotiable in her courtroom. During a brief pause, Judge Johnson requested additional documentation regarding the officers' past conduct and any complaints filed against them. She wanted to ensure that the decision she would make regarding accountability was based on facts and records. The officers, now fully aware of the seriousness of the situation, remained silent, recognizing that their earlier mockery had placed them under close scrutiny. The public in the courtroom watched with a mix of curiosity and admiration, understanding that the judge was addressing more than just a legal case. She was reinforcing the principles of integrity and respect. When the hearing resumed, Judge Johnson made her move. She explained that the officers' behavior in the courtroom was unacceptable and undermined public trust in law enforcement. She outlined the potential consequences, including formal reprimands, mandatory sensitivity training, and public accountability measures. Her approach was calm but authoritative, demonstrating that respect and accountability could be enforced without anger or humiliation. The officers, now subdued, understood that their actions had serious implications. The courtroom remained attentive as Judge Johnson continued to address the officers, emphasizing that accountability was not meant to punish arbitrarily, but to uphold the integrity of the legal system and maintain public trust. Her words were measured, clear, and impactful. The officers, for the first time, seemed to fully comprehend the gravity of their actions and the importance of their roles as public servants. The public in the gallery recognized the significance of this moment, witnessing a display of leadership that balanced justice, strategy, and dignity. Judge Johnson then called the police chief forward, asking for the department's response and support in ensuring that the officers adhered to professional standards. The chief outlined specific steps that would be taken, including follow-up reviews and training programs, to ensure that such behavior would not occur again. The officers listened quietly, realizing that the entire system had taken notice of their conduct. The courtroom atmosphere shifted from tension to a sense of accountability and resolution. Throughout the session, Judge Johnson managed the legal proceedings with precision, ensuring that the case moved forward, while reinforcing the lessons of respect and professionalism. She asked detailed questions, carefully considered each piece of evidence, and guided the lawyers through procedural matters. Her calm, authoritative presence maintained order and focus, turning what could have been a chaotic and disrespectful environment into a model of courtroom decorum and strategic leadership. By mid-afternoon, the officers were fully aware of the consequences of their behavior. Judge Johnson had successfully transformed their previous arrogance and mockery into a lesson in accountability and professionalism. The public, lawyers, and even the officers themselves recognized the effectiveness of her approach. She had addressed disrespect not through anger or confrontation, but through intelligence, strategy, and calm authority. As the hearing concluded, Judge Johnson summarized the key outcomes. She reinforced that respect, professionalism, and accountability were fundamental to the justice system. She explained the steps that would be taken regarding the officers' conduct, emphasizing that these actions were necessary to maintain public trust and ensure that the law was upheld with integrity. Her words resonated throughout the courtroom, leaving no doubt about her authority and the importance of the principles she had enforced. The officers left the courtroom with a clear understanding that their actions had consequences, and the public left inspired by Judge Johnson's composure, intelligence, and strategic handling of the situation. Her approach had demonstrated that true leadership involved patience, thoughtful action, and the ability to maintain dignity under pressure. The courtroom had become more than just a place for legal proceedings. It had become a stage for lessons in respect, accountability, and the power of calm authority. After everyone had left, Judge Johnson reflected on the